Hey guys, I have a lot of Scrabble players come up to me and ask me, "Hey Mac, how did you get so good at endgames? How do you study endgames methodically?" And what I always like to tell people is that every single game of Scrabble you see, whether you play it or not, and whether it's close or not, is inherently an endgame puzzle. Because obviously, if you're down 100 points with just a couple tiles left, you're probably not going to win an endgame. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of value in trying to find the optimal endgame. And by optimal endgame, I mean the play that decreases your margin of defeat. Or in the case where you're up 100 points and basically any play you make wins, trying to find the play that maximizes your margin of victory. Not only is this good because point spread can matter as a tiebreaker in tournaments, but it's good practice for trying to find the optimal endgame when it really matters more. So, what I always tell my students is every single game they play, they should try to find the optimal endgame from the first position they had where there were no tiles left in the bag and thus they had full knowledge of their opponent's rack. And they should completely ignore what the actual game score is and just try to find the sequence that gets them the best margin relative to where it stands initially. I'll show you what that means a little bit as I go through the example I have on the screen. This is an actual game I encountered with one of my students as we teamed up against the computer Hastybot a week or two ago. And in this position, we were completely lost. Hastybot has just played Hod to go up by 94 points, and we were sitting on AEFP, as you can see below. Hastybot had just 2 tiles left, an L and an N. And my student and I were very much aware that we were not winning this game. But I encouraged him to still try to find the best endgame possible, try to minimize his margin of defeat. Because the best endgame here is very instructive. Especially considering you only have 4 tiles left and your opponent has 2, the complexity of this endgame might be somewhat surprising. So what I'm going to do, guys, for this analysis, in keeping with what I described before, is I'm going to completely white out the actual score, and we're going to start this analysis at a margin of 0, and we're going to look at a bunch of different endgames and try to figure out which one of them gives me the best margin. So let's think about this a little bit. What is my goal here? Well, my first question I want to ask myself, as pretty much it is in all Scrabble endgames, is can I go out? Do I have a place to play all 4 of my tiles A, E, F, P? And it's not too hard to convince yourself that I don't. There are not a lot of words with an F and a P, and there is indeed no outplay here. The next question I like to ask myself is, can my opponent go out? And your first instinct is, yeah, probably. They've got an L and an N, it's only 2 letters, they're both 1-pointers, they're both pretty easy to use. And a closer look at the board reveals that they can indeed go out. They are threatening to play the word Lin through the IN radix, making nuke. However, interestingly, that is their only available outplay. So they do not have a backup option if I were to choose to block Lin. That is certainly something that's interesting to note and is going to affect the rest of the analysis. The most simple approach here, and the one that we initially considered, is just, okay, what happens if we let them have their outplay and maximize our own score? We have some pretty high scoring plays. We can play, for instance, F for 28 points in this spot under elegy, making we an elf. If we do that, we get 28 points, so that's going to be a plus 28 entry in our cumulative margin tally on the right. After that, then as I mentioned before, Hastybot is going to go out with Lin and Nuke for 14 points. This is an opponent play, so this is going to be a negative 14 as it negatively impacts our overall margin. And that's not all, because after Hastybot goes out, it gets 8 bonus points as a penalty from our unplayed A and P. So that's another 8 points for Hastybot, and thus another negative 8 in the margin tally on the right. So now the game is over, and we have our final tally. We have a 28 for F, and then a minus 14 and a minus 8. And if you sum all of those, that nets to plus 6. So once again, what that means is in the original position, if we play F, we're going to end up 6 points better relative to our opponent than we were in the starting position. So not bad, but can we do better? It turns out we have one better play that doesn't block Hastybot's out, and that's to play Ape for 30 above Hod. I'll leave you guys to check the math that this ends with a final margin of plus 8, which is 2 better than the plus 6 we just saw after F. However, we can indeed do even better if we block Lin. I don't think it's terribly hard to reason out that you're going to do much better than plus 8 if you block Lin. Because if Hastybot can't go out, it's not going to score very many points. After all, it just has 2 1-point tiles. So with just a single 1-point tile, it's probably not going to get more than a single-digit number of points. And if you're able to block and go out in 2, you're probably going to accumulate quite a bit more than that and end up netting more than plus 8. However, where this gets tricky is trying to figure out how do you optimize this. There are plenty of ways to block Lin, but how do you block Lin in a way that gives you the best margin? And that's when things get really interesting and tricky. The first thing you have to do is be careful that the play you make that you think blocks actually blocks. My first instinct was actually to play P over here, but then I realized that this actually allows Hastybot to just go out with lane through the AI on the board, so that clearly doesn't work. My student at one point also suggested playing Pa over here, a clever idea, holding the high-scoring F we mentioned before in reserve for the next turn. However, this has a huge problem, namely Lin still plays and for 10 more points, now making Pal. The next idea we came up with was playing this word to the G for 14 points, which does indeed effectively block Hastybot's outplay. Hastybot's highest scoring response would now be to just play in and nuke, scoring 10 points and keeping the L. So let's catch up on our margin. Our play to the G scored 14 points. Hastybot's play of in and nuke would score 10, so that means we have a plus 14 and a negative 10 in the margin column on the right. After that, our best outplay is PE and E for 18 points in the top left, so we now add a plus 18. And finally, on top of that, since we now play out and catch Hastybot with an unplayed L, that's another plus 2. So we've got a plus 14, a minus 10, a plus 18, and a plus 2, and I'll leave you guys to check, that adds up to plus 24. So that is a heck of a lot better, in fact 16 points better than the plus 8 margin we found from playing Ape and simply letting Hastybot go out. This really illustrates the value, guys, of going out first in most Scrabble endgames. But that's not all. While this line is pretty solid, there is indeed one better way you can go about this endgame, and I did manage to find it over the board. My student was actually on the right track when he suggested Pa over here. It's a really clever idea to try to save the high-scoring F for our next play. The problem, like I said, is that this doesn't actually block, so what we actually want to do here is find a different way to block using the same two letters, namely the A and the P. And there's really only one way to do it, namely DAP for just 6 points. This looks really weird. After all, you're only scoring 6 when you can block for a lot more than that. But, like I said, the potential to play F for a lot of points on your next turn outweighs the initial increase you get from the play I showed before, since you're not getting nearly as much for the P and the E as you are for the F and the E on your subsequent turn. So that's where these sequences get tricky, guys. You have to plan not just for your immediate turn, but for your next turn and figure out how to maximize the points over both of those turns combined. So let's do some margin calculations now on DAP and show why this really is better than the play I mentioned before. DAP is 6 points, so that puts a plus 6 in the margin column. Your opponent's highest scoring play is now going to be either Al and La or An and Na for 8 points. It doesn't matter. Let's say they play Al and La, so that's now a negative 8 in the margin column. You go out with F as planned for 28, and after that, you get 2 more points from your opponent's unplayed N, so your final margin is plus 6, minus 8, plus 28, plus 2, or plus 28, which is 4 points better than the plus 24 we looked at before. Why? Well, the sequence of DAP followed by F is 2 points better for you than the sequence we looked at before, and you now take away your opponent's play of in and nuke for 10 and force them to play for 8 instead. So you gain 2 points and your opponent loses 2 points, which means your overall margin increases by 4. Now, you might be wondering, well, wait a minute, Mac, let's go back a couple of turns ago when your opponent played Al and La. Can't they try to block your outplay of F and sacrifice a couple points to play something like L for 6 points? Excellent question. They can, and in fact they should. If they play L for 6, then that adds a minus 6 to the margin column, and you don't have F for 28 anymore, but you do still have F for 25, making E and Fa above Hod. So that adds a plus 25, and then a plus 2 for your opponent's unplayed N. So plus 6 minus 6 plus 25 plus 2 is now plus 27. So not quite plus 28 in the line where your opponent plays Al and La, but plus 27 is indeed still better than the plus 24 we saw in the earlier line. So it turns out that DAP is the optimal endgame here with a margin of plus 27, assuming optimal play by your opponent. But you can see, guys, how trying to calculate these outs in 2 have a lot of layers, because you have to think not only about what's your best sequence, but also how your opponent's going to react. If the game were close enough, noting that your opponent can block with L and seeing that 1 point difference could easily make the difference between a win and a tie or a tie and a loss. So you really need to be careful. You really need to calculate a lot of different variations. And this is the part of Scrabble I always like to say is the most similar to chess, because things are very concrete. You have perfect information, and so does your opponent, and that's the only time in an entire Scrabble game you do, because the bag is empty and you don't have the element of randomness due to drawing tiles. And because of that, it all becomes a matter of brute force calculation and puzzle solving, just like a chess endgame or really any chess position. So I think that's really cool, and I hope this video gave you guys a deeper appreciation of how even seemingly simple Scrabble endgames can in fact be very complex and require a lot of precise calculation and board vision. And I hope the technique I showed you with the margin calculations on the right, as well as just the idea of using every single game you play as an endgame puzzle, is helpful to you and really helps you improve your Scrabble endgames. Let me know what you think of these ideas in the comments. Any feedback welcome as always. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Really appreciate your support. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all soon for the next video. Bye-bye.